Давайте я расскажу, что в этом зале будет происходить. Сейчас в этом зале, в зеленом зале, начнется лекция Дэниела Латорре на тему онлайн-инструменты вовлечения жителей, процессы, перепланирования города. Дэниел прилетел из Нью-Йорка, он сооснователь проекта проекта и основатель проекта City. В оранжевом зале на третьем этаже начинается дискуссия на тему самоорганизованных пространств для активистских сообществ. Участники Юрий Бушмелев, кафе Роман Красильников, арт-пространство четверть, Владимир Скопицын. В подробности красный зал начинается лекция «Как свой лес стать муниципальным депутатом». Красный зал находится на третьем этаже. В зале дискуссии на первом этаже начинается дискуссия, естественно, на тему девушек красных, роли незнакомца, проектирование публичного пространства, про страхи в городе, эмоциональное восприятие города и другие темы. Давайте просто вас в течение буквально одной минуты определиться с площадкой, и мы начинаем. Еще, знаете, важный момент, друзья. Дэниел будет говорить по-английски. У нас есть приемники для синхронного перевода. Можно пройти и получить их вот за картонной стойкой с левой стороны. И так все будет гораздо понятнее. Берите приемники и возвращайтесь. Дэниел Латорре.
Hello. Spasiba. So, if anyone again wants the headsets, who do they go? Who has headsets? Where are they? Oh, okay. All right. So, can everyone hear me? Okay. Yeah. Louder. All right. Is that better? All right. Since the screen is here, if some of you on the edge want to sit over here, there's more space. If you wanted to get closer, there are more seats. So I'm going to talk for just about 30 minutes, and then we will hopefully have 10 minutes of time for questions, discussion. So just to explain where I'm coming from, because I always like to know who the hell is speaking. I'm actually born in Bogota, Colombia. I'm actually half Colombian, half American. My father is from Bogota, and my mother is Norwegian American. So I grew up in a very urban environment, right in the middle of the city, next to a plaza. So my backyard, my playground, was a plaza with a fountain and a church and pigeons and street vendors, food vendors, and other children and other families. And then we moved to San Diego, California. So then my backyard or my playground became the beach, which is a very different urban environment. Then we moved to to Minneapolis, which is in the center of the United States, and it's very cold. But I didn't live in the city, I lived in the suburbs, and became very alienated with that type of living environment because there were no people. It wasn't a city, it was just houses and yards and cars. So I moved to New York City 18 years ago in 1996. And then I felt at home because it was a city where everyone is welcome and it's dense and there's lots of activity. And I didn't realize this at the time, but it basically felt like Bogota. It felt, or in the same way like how it is here in Moscow, a very dense, culturally active city. Especially now that you have all the new pedestrian streets in the center of the city. But I became an urbanist after 9/11 when I saw that basically even cities that seem permanent can change, and can change very quickly. So I actually became very inspired by the fact that that life can be very impermanent. And also because my background is in software, I'm a product designer for software, all of a sudden I realized that perhaps the more powerful thing, like we say how great the web is and how great digital media is and Facebook and Twitter, but actually the way that we live in our cities is actually more profound. So the experience of walking to work is perhaps more important than how we email each other. Because in some cities you're afraid for your life for getting hit by a car, because the cities that are designed for cars are very dangerous. They're very alienating. So I studied anthropology, so my whole background is coming from that type of perspective of looking at people, trying to understand how people do things. And so I joined the internet and started working at different corporations, banks, and fashion companies. But eventually I promised myself on 9/11 that I wanted to use my technology skills for civic purposes, for something that was meaningful. And so I eventually ended up at Project for Public Spaces, which is the nonprofit that basically created the idea of placemaking, which is human-centered or community-centered urban design. And they hired me to figure out how to use digital technology to do placemaking. And then I did that, and now I have my own consulting practice where I help cities and foundations, community organizations figure out how to use technology in the wise way, because technology can also be used in bad ways. Technology can also be used to alienate each other, or to basically further very neoliberal agendas that are actually against human participation. So a lot of what I do simply is I end up making websites or applications that are about mapping ideas, mapping people's challenges or problems, and helping citizens and government communicate with each other in a productive way, or creating pressure on the government to change so that they listen to citizens. And so part of what's happening, what I want to just explain, is that we're living in a very different environment now because of the technology. So there's this idea called the Gutenberg parenthesis, which basically says this, is that before the printing press, our culture was very oral. We told stories to each other. And when you tell a story, you change it. So when you tell your favorite myth or your favorite fable to someone else, you say it differently. You emphasize what's meaningful to you or to your friends or your family, because you're trying to also communicate meaning and value. And no one knows the origin of most fables. You know, the Greek stories are a lot of them are the only thing that we know is who wrote it down, but we don't know who originally invented that story. But then when the printing press was invented, all of a sudden things became very linear. Authorship, who wrote it, was very important, and it became more centralized. The communication and cultural information became very, very centralized. So a lot of the researchers on how technology affects society, or sort of media anthropologists, have basically said that nation states were created because of print, that the printing press allowed the creation of large nation states. So what does that mean? Where now, since the rise of social media and highly networked communication systems, we're now living in a culture that is much more about sharing and remixing and appropriating, and it's much more conversational. So if printing presses allowed the creation of a nation state, what does that mean if our communication system that we now live in is decentralized and is more distributed? So this is part of what we're seeing in society now, is this power shift. Power is already shifting because the technology is shifting. So there's this choice. I won't read this quote to you, but basically the point is that we can either use technology to enhance our human attributes, our very social human abilities, or we can use technology to suppress or control our natural desire to cooperate and to create with each other, or independently. So again, we move from this centralized communication system. Radio and television are essentially coming from a print consciousness, because they also are highly centralized. But of course, the social media that we have is radically decentralized. This here is an animation, a slide, showing cultural uprisings or cultural protests, created by an MIT researcher who made an animation of protests since 1950. So I'm going to try to see if we can look at the animation just to show you briefly, and if it doesn't work, I'll switch backwards. All right, I don't think this is online right now. So, anyhow, so in 1950, 1960, 1970, the animation just shows a few protests happening here and there. But this is a slide from around 2011, and of course, Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, the events that have been happening in China that largely haven't received a lot of press. There's been an explosion in social uprisings that very much correlate to the rise of social media and network media. And I don't think that that's an accident. So here's an example of what this means in terms of how it's affecting our urban environment. So in Istanbul, how many know the origin, or what was the spark in Gezi Park? Why were people so upset about what was happening in Gezi Park? There's a question. The Gezi Park in central Istanbul. Okay. So there's a public space in the center of Istanbul called Gezi Park, and the government decided to build a shopping mall, to get rid of the public space and build a shopping mall. And Istanbul has very little public space. So because of all of the other issues that have been going on, that became the symbol, or the last straw for the citizens. And that's what led to the occupation of Gezi Park, because it became the ultimate symbol of this battle of creating cities for people versus creating cities focused on business. And it wasn't just, the same idea wasn't just in Gezi Park. This is actually a quote from some of the organizers in the Egyptian Revolution, and which says, as the interests of government increasingly cater to the interests and comforts of private transnational capital, our cities and homes have become progressively more abstract and violent places, subject to the casual ravages of the next economic development and or urban renewal scheme. So these were words from the organizers in the Egyptian Revolution, sent in a letter to the Occupy Wall Street organizers. But it's basically the same complaint or the same criticism that the protesters in Istanbul had with the Erdogan government. So around that time, here's a message of solidarity from Budapest. And this sign says, when all that capitalism can offer is shopping malls and tear gas, defending a park turns into a fight for life itself. So the question is, why is a 19-year-old or 21-year-old woman in Budapest, why did she write this sign? You know, what is happening in our cities where cities around the world are all facing the same type of conflict of priority conflict over how to develop the city? For who is the city for? In Tunisia, so the beginning of the Arab Spring uprising happened was sparked by the administration of Tunis banning street vendors. So the city of the said that street vending is dirty, it's old-fashioned, we want to be modern, it has no place in a modern city, according to what they thought, what they decided a modern city should be. And one of the vendors who lost his work has a family and has 2 children, and he's in the lowest class of society and felt so upset that he lit himself on fire. And then so he became a martyr for this issue. So but the reality is that street vending is actually one of the cheapest, most effective tactics for making a good public space. And in fact, right now in the US, you have a lot of cities looking to attract street vendors to make public space more active, to give people a reason to use a public space. Because it cannot just be an empty space or a green space. You have to have something to do in the public space. So basically, part of this dilemma that I want to kind of share with you, and like the comments that were made earlier about how we sort of are given too much credit to technology, is coming from this technocratic idea, or this what I call the technocratic virus. So you have this idea where science and technology, if only we have enough science, and if only we have smarter people who are the technologists, then they will be able to make all the decisions for us. And so you have this same idea in smarter cities and in big data. You know, the belief in a lot of those ideas within urban planning are, well, the city can now be managed more efficiently if we have more technology. So whether you're talking about Gosplan or in the United States, the Federal Department of Agriculture, which is this building, in the 1950s, they approved a chemical to help get rid of bugs in crops to increase crop production, food production. But 15 years later, they found out that that chemical actually was leading to miscarriages, birth miscarriages and birth defects, abnormalities. So it created a huge human impact. But at the time, of course, the scientists and the government said, we can make living better through technology. We can make living better through chemistry. So there was a very blind belief in the technology. And they said, well, maybe it was just because after a while, maybe it was just because our supercomputers in the 60s were too slow. So we got faster and smaller computers in 1980s. And then that was seen as that's the new revolution, is the personal computers. And it certainly made a lot of changes, but basically what we're also creating, as was just mentioned with things like PRISM and all of what the NSA is doing in the United States, is a lot of this technology is actually being used to make a virtual prison or virtual panopticon, where there can be maximum surveillance. So the idea of the smart city is basically now realized like this. This is a data center in Rio de Janeiro created by IBM. And this is, to them, the utopia of the future is a city that has all this technology to constantly monitor all aspects of the city that can be counted. So the things that can't be counted, they don't have an answer for. But this to me is not the definition of a smart city, because they're basically using the same idea, which is this very blind belief that technology alone is the solution. So what we're talking about is basically the better side is we're really dealing with a post-digital opportunity. So now that technology is so pervasive, you have things like this that happened in the Egyptian revolution. So the way that, because the Mubarak government was so oppressive in controlling protest, the organizers knew that they couldn't just post messages online about where to protest. So they used different tricks like using dating websites to organize and plan meetings. So it would look like they're dating and flirting with each other, but they were actually organizing where to protest. But when it came time to spread the word about a protest, what they did was they said there was going to be a protest, like 2 months from now. And they knew that the government would block that date or block that space. So what they did is they intentionally went into the taxis in Cairo, because the taxis in Cairo are very cheap. And they said they would have two people in the taxi speaking to each other, saying when the date of the real protest was going to be. So they used the network of the taxi drivers. So then other people would come in the taxi who weren't organizers, and they would say, have you heard when the protest is? The taxi driver would say, like, well, I heard it's going to be on January 25th. And that's how they spread information and got around the government from stopping them to organize. So that's post-digital, because yet they coordinated by using digital media, but they weren't only relying on it. They were actually relying on a very standard sort of form of network. In Gezi Park, of course, people, like I was saying earlier, they got upset about the urban planning agenda and other things. They used websites to organize neighborhood assemblies. So they were using technology, but the reason why was to do this, was to meet in person. So again, like the digital placemaking sort of on a protest level was to organize on a micro or hyper-local level. One of the main organizing groups is a football club called Karshi. Does anyone speak Turkish? No? Okay. Karshi, they were very good at organizing. They actually were so bold as to use construction equipment to block the destruction of the park. But what Karshi means in Turkish is marketplace. That's the name of their football club and their organization, because they met in a marketplace. So again, there's this very direct connection between public space and citizen power. Some of the work that I've been doing with Occupy Wall Street has been in this project called Occupy Town Square, where we use parks to have protests. But I quickly realized that we needed to use urban design techniques. So here's a protest in Washington Square in the downtown Manhattan. But as you can see, it just looks like a bunch of people, right? So it wasn't really working because you can't tell what anyone is doing. Same thing with this. This was on May Day in 2012, and there's a bunch of people there, but they could be having a picnic, or it could be a corporate function, or a music event, who knows? So what we did is we started looking at the visual analysis, kind of using wayfinding techniques from urban planning, and started realizing, well, where do we need to make signage? How do we design the visibility of this temporary place to activate it visually and socially? We looked at maps and we looked at the sight lines. So when we were going to occupy a space, we figured out, so when the press and the media are taking photos, so that it looks like a protest, so that it looks like it's something different. So this was how we did it differently. We had banners with our messages in bright orange colors. We had signs on buildings and elevated much higher that were much visible all around, so that pretty much from any angle, the spectacle was made legible. You could read the spectacle. Otherwise, it was just a bunch of people sitting together. We had to do open space meetings where we could have like self-organizing conferences in public space to talk about protest issues. We made these sort of temporary place indicators, just made from a hardware store. This is like plastic tubing and screen printed letters. So what that meant was when you organize a sort of flash conference in a park, you would then know where to go. So you would say, go to letter C, and if you want to talk about guerrilla gardening, you can go to flag number C. If you want to talk about digital privacy, go to flag I. So it was very organic and rapid in the way to organize public space by using very simple placemaking and wayfinding techniques. And so we kind of considered ourselves, and we had a list of services of what this sort of temporary occupation was about, which was primarily about building the movement, so getting more people to participate, and getting local neighbors to organize in a more effective manner, and then basically demonstrating the whole idea of Occupy Wall Street, which was about a vision of a society that isn't revolving around material wealth or financial accomplishment. There's also the hurricane in the Sandy hurricane, which hit New York City. And so the city has no money, so it was very slow for the city to provide services. So we used more wayfinding techniques to let people know where the Occupy relief centers were. We had like ad hoc resource centers where people get water, they could get charge their cell phone, they could get food, they could get emergency assistance. And then we screen printed them, like on wood, with some artists that were in a screen printed collective. We did this all in 2 weeks. We designed it, and then we put on vests, so we looked sort of like city officials, sort of. And then we mounted these signs that said, you know, it's a 23-minute walk to this relief center to get electricity and water. We did this right in front of the police, and they never said anything. Because partly the need was so dramatic, but also because we looked like we were supposed to be doing this. There was a blurry, fuzzy distinction between whose city is this, who is in charge of the city. And that was part of what we were trying to contest, was that the city should be run by everybody. It shouldn't just be run by the experts. A lot of the people in this neighborhood run by buses, so this was also just very useful for that period. Let me see. So just to conclude, so we have time. We have time for questions, or
8 minutes.
8 minutes for questions. Okay, so let me finish. So basically, the traditional or the basic idea of placemaking is that it's against this. The status quo or the expert-driven process is the experts make all they define the problem, and then they do the design, and then they show the public some idea. some plan for the city. Sometimes this works. Sometimes this is okay if they really know and have already been thinking and communicating with the community. But oftentimes they aren't. And this leads to failed projects. Bicycle lanes where bicyclists don't want bicycle lanes, for example. But the placemaking approach starts with just having meetings like this to gather public input and to not do any design work until you understand the community first. Then the experts can come and design based off of a community vision. So it's like the other way around. Here they design first, then they talk to the community. Here you talk to the community first, then you design. So it's upside down. And that's the main idea of placemaking, which is community-centered urbanism, or human-centered urbanism. And it's also about being very iterative. So instead of being linear, so like the Gutenberg era, the print era, it's very command, control, centralized, and linear. In this more digital era, it's about being very iterative and trying tactics over and over again. Let me just show you what I mean. So so when you add the digital communication into this goal of community input, you get more feedback from the community, but you also have feedback after it's built. So if we design a park in this method, we can still use these digital methods to say, is the park working? Or maybe there's new ideas for the park after it's already been built. Because the other important principle with placemaking is that the design is never finished. There's never the ultimate design because life is constantly changing. The city is constantly changing. The neighborhood is changing. So you have to have an open flexibility to all of this. So this idea is referred to as lighter, quicker, cheaper, or agile urbanism. There's all these different terms because it's new, so people are trying to label it. But basically, it's as simple as doing DIY bicycle lanes by just spray painting to test where bicycle lanes can be, to then slowly building things up. So if you're doing a park, you can just lay grass in the middle of the street to demonstrate that this street can be made into a public space. And over time, you can then actually convince or work with the city, or the city can do this to find out where will a more permanent space work on a social level and a financial level. Here's one example. This was a very dangerous intersection. A lot of pedestrians were being hit. And so the citizens organized and convinced the department to paint indicators to make it more visible to the drivers. And they did version 1, version 2, and then in version 3, they actually poured concrete and actually made it physically difficult for drivers to turn very fast. So the cars had to slow down in order to turn the corner, which reduced the deaths and accidents with people. But of course, with this iterative approach, they were able to make it safer just by adding paint, instead of waiting to build the final, the better solution. So again, this is this attitude of being temporary, being responsive, working immediately. And you see this in bigger projects like in Paris, there's Paris Plage, where they converted a freeway along the river and then iteratively tested making it into a park. So now it's sort of like a beach in the middle of the city. And they're now closing the freeway permanently, and they're still testing and figuring out how to make it more social, because people are constantly having new ideas. So this can happen on a very small scale or on a large scale. And just to close with one example, 2 minutes? 0. Okay.
Maybe
so,
2 minutes
no question.
okay. All right. Well, let me stop there and see if there are any questions.
I know there are interesting mapping services which are, for example, Great Britain, like Fix My Street, actually have better citizens like governmental local board.org. So using these services, you can apply project based on the idea that society activists can work on infrastructures questions by themselves or connected with government.
Oh, so yeah, so this can work either way. So her question was, where does this start, or how can this happen? And so you may have a government official who understands this, who wants to use this new form of urban planning. But if you don't, then you need to do it yourself. You need to start something to make the city listen. So here's one quick example. A retired man painted a big staircase in Rio de Janeiro, a colorful rainbow colors. It became a huge success. And because we live in this post-digital world, it got all this attention on Twitter and Facebook and blogs, etc. But the government thought he was doing that to support the protesters who were having all the riots and protests about the transportation, increasing the metro fare. So they painted over his stairs because they thought he was being subversive. But because we're in this post-digital world, that generated even more attention. So the people were said this is, it just became, because he did it to the place, he made this message about community values to the place. Anyone that looks at this photo says this is clearly better. This may be dangerous. A woman by herself might feel not safe walking on this at nighttime. This has more people. People meet. It became a social space. So the government painted it back, but government didn't do as good of a job. So then it created more controversy on social media and in the news, in the New York Times, etc. So then finally the government allowed the people to paint it back to how it was originally. And so again, that interaction, by using placemaking but connecting it to pressuring the government to change, works. So imagine if there were 12 of these projects in a section of the city, in one neighborhood, So you could strategically do things like this as part of a campaign to change the government. And that's what's happening in cities in the US and in Latin America, especially. And it works. I think it can work anywhere because it's about the basic human dynamic.
Вопроса нет времени, но Дэниел здесь, и завтра он будет экспертом на хакатоне в течение всего дня, и можно будет с ним пообщаться. И в течение всего дня мы как раз, в принципе, будем заниматься анализом каких-то проблем московских, и можно будет поучаствовать и на практике немножко все это освоить в течение всего дня. Так что завтра начало в 11, и с Дэниелом можно будет пообщаться подробно. И он говорит, что если у вас есть вопросы, то он еще здесь тоже весь день, так что с ним можно подойти, поговорить, и он будет рад ответить на вопросы. А сейчас у нас продолжение программы.